Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into one of history's most disturbing and hidden practices, a world where young men were bought, sold, and broken in ways that would make your stomach turn. We're talking about the horrific reality of Chinese male concubines, a system so brutal and dehumanizing that it makes medieval torture chambers look like luxury spas. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're a 12-year-old boy in Ming Dynasty China. Your family is drowning in debt. The harvest has failed for the third year running, and your father makes a decision that will haunt your nightmares forever. He doesn't sell you to a farm or a merchant. He sells you to become a nanfeng, a male concubine, destined for a life of sexual slavery that will strip away every shred of dignity you might have possessed. This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't Hollywood fiction. This was reality for thousands of Chinese boys across multiple dynasties, spanning over 1,000 years of systematic abuse and exploitation. When we think of concubines in ancient China, most people imagine beautiful women in silk robes, living in luxurious quarters, perhaps wielding some political influence behind the scenes. But what history textbooks conveniently ignore is the parallel world of male concubines, young men who were subjected to horrors that would make grown adults weep. These weren't willing participants in some romanticized court intrigue. They were victims of a system so cruel, so methodically designed to break the human spirit, that even the most hardened historians struggle to document it without feeling sick. Tonight, we're going to explore the unthinkable reality these boys faced. From the moment they were purchased like livestock at markets that specialized in human flesh, to the surgical mutilations they endured to make them more appealing to their masters, to the psychological torture that turned proud young men into hollow shells of humanity. We'll examine how this practice flourished under the protection of emperors and nobles, how it was justified by twisted philosophy, and how boys as young as 10 were systematically destroyed in ways that challenge everything we think we know about human decency. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. This wasn't some underground criminal enterprise operating in the shadows. This was legal. This was accepted. This was normal. Wealthy merchants, government officials, and even emperors openly kept male concubines, treating them as status symbols, while subjecting them to daily humiliations that would be considered war crimes by today's standards. The very people who were supposed to protect society's most vulnerable were the ones orchestrating their destruction. And if you think this was just about sex, you're only scratching the surface. The system of male concubinage in China was a complex web of power, control, and systematic dehumanization that served multiple purposes for the ruling class. These boys weren't just sexual objects. They were political tools, social currency, and living symbols of their masters' wealth and influence. Every aspect of their existence was controlled, from what they wore to how they walked, from what they ate to when they were allowed to sleep. What we're about to uncover will challenge your understanding of human nature itself. How could an entire civilization, one that produced incredible art, philosophy, and technological innovations, simultaneously create and maintain a system of such breathtaking cruelty? How did parents justify selling their own children into sexual slavery? How did society convince itself that this was acceptable, even admirable? The answers lie in a combination of economic desperation, cultural traditions, and a power structure that viewed certain human beings as disposable commodities. But understanding the why doesn't make the what any less horrifying. These boys lived through experiences that would break most adults, and they did it while still being children, with all the psychological vulnerability that entails. Over the next hour, we're going to walk through this nightmare step by step. We'll start with how boys were selected and purchased, a process that involved examining them like livestock at markets that operated with the efficiency of modern corporations. We'll explore the modifications they underwent, surgical procedures performed without anesthesia that permanently altered their bodies to serve their masters' preferences. We'll dive into their daily lives, if you can call them lives, filled with rituals of humiliation that were designed to strip away every last vestige of personal identity. But we won't stop there. We'll examine how this system affected Chinese society as a whole, creating a culture where the sexual exploitation of children was not just tolerated, but celebrated. We'll look at the psychological techniques used to break these boys' spirits, methods so sophisticated they would make trained interrogators uncomfortable. And we'll explore how some of these young men, against all odds, managed to survive and occasionally even thrive within this system of institutionalized abuse. This isn't just history. This is a window into the darkest corners of human behavior, a reminder that civilization is often just a thin veneer covering practices that would make animals recoil in disgust. The story of Chinese male concubines forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, sexuality, and the lengths to which human beings will go to dominate and control each other. And here's something that will chill you to the bone. Much of what we know about this practice comes from the writings of the perpetrators themselves, men who documented their treatment of these boys with the same casual tone they might use to describe breaking in a new horse. They saw nothing wrong with what they were doing. In fact, they were proud of it, viewing their collections of male concubines as evidence of their sophistication and worldliness. The records they left behind read like instruction manuals for psychological torture, complete with detailed descriptions of how to select the most vulnerable boys, how to condition them for compliance, and how to maintain control over them as they grew older. These weren't the ravings of madmen operating on society's fringes. These were respected members of the community, pillars of society who saw the systematic abuse of children as just another aspect of refined living. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how this practice was woven into the very fabric of Chinese culture, becoming so normalized that resistance was almost unthinkable. Families didn't just tolerate the sale of their sons into sexual slavery. They often competed for the privilege, viewing it as a path to social advancement. Boys who showed signs of beauty or intelligence were groomed from infancy for this fate, their parents already counting the silver they would receive when the time came to sell them. The system created its own ecosystem of enablers, from the scouts who traveled the countryside looking for suitable boys, to the trainers who broke them in, to the doctors who performed the modifications that increased their market value. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone profited except the boys themselves, who paid with their bodies, their minds, and ultimately, their souls. As we journey deeper into this darkness tonight, remember that every statistic we discuss represents a real human being, a child who experienced unimaginable suffering while the world around him continued as if nothing was wrong. These weren't numbers in a ledger or characters in a story. They were sons, brothers, human beings with hopes and dreams that were systematically crushed by a society that viewed them as disposable objects. The practice of male concubinage in China didn't emerge overnight. It developed over centuries, refined and perfected with each generation, until it became a machine of human destruction that operated with terrifying efficiency. What started as isolated incidents of abuse eventually became institutionalized practices that were passed down from father to son, like family traditions. And the most heartbreaking part? Many of these boys never knew any other life. They were so young when they were taken, so thoroughly conditioned by their treatment, that they came to believe this was their natural state. They lost not just their freedom and their innocence, but their very sense of self, becoming hollow vessels filled only with their master's desires and expectations. Tonight, we're going to honor their memory by telling their story, by refusing to let their suffering disappear into the comfortable silence that history often uses to cover its most shameful chapters. We're going to look directly at what was done to them, not because we enjoy the horror, but because forgetting would be the final insult to their memory. The journey we're about to take together will test your stomach, challenge your assumptions, and force you to confront the uncomfortable reality that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists within every human civilization. But it will also remind you why we must never stop fighting against the forces that seek to dehumanize and exploit the vulnerable, no matter how respectable they might appear on the surface. So steel yourself for what's coming, because the story of Chinese male concubines is about to unfold in all its horrifying detail. And once you understand what these boys endured, you'll never look at power, tradition, or human nature the same way again. The procurement process for male concubines was a business enterprise that operated with the cold efficiency of a slaughterhouse. Across the Chinese Empire, specialized markets emerged where human flesh was bought and sold like grain or livestock. These weren't back-alley transactions conducted in shame and secrecy. They were legitimate commercial operations, complete with permanent structures, established vendors, and regular customers who browsed the available merchandise with the casual interest of someone shopping for furniture. The boys arrived at these markets through various channels, but the most common was outright sale by their own families. Parents facing starvation or crippling debt would make calculations that defied every natural instinct, weighing the price they could get for their son against the mouths they could no longer afford to feed. The going rate varied depending on the boy's age, appearance, and perceived potential, but it was always enough to keep a family alive for several months, maybe even a full year if they were careful. But families weren't the only suppliers. Professional scouts roamed the countryside like human predators, identifying promising candidates and negotiating with desperate parents. These men had trained eyes, able to spot the subtle signs that would make a boy valuable in the concubine trade. They looked for specific physical characteristics, certain personality traits, and most importantly, that indefinable quality of vulnerability that suggested a child could be broken and reshaped without too much resistance. The selection process itself was a masterclass in dehumanization. Boys were stripped naked and examined like horses at auction, their bodies probed and assessed by potential buyers who discussed their merits and flaws with clinical detachment. Teeth were checked for straightness and health. Skin was examined for blemishes or scars. Muscle tone was evaluated. Even the shape of their feet and hands was scrutinized, as certain physical characteristics were considered more aesthetically pleasing than others. Age was perhaps the most critical factor. The ideal candidate was between 10 and 14 years old, young enough to be easily molded, but old enough to survive the rigors of training and modification. Boys younger than 10 were considered too fragile and unpredictable, while those older than 14 were seen as potentially too set in their ways to be properly conditioned. The sweet spot was 12 years old, an age when a child was still utterly dependent on adults, but had developed enough physical resilience to endure what was coming. The buyers came from all levels of society, but they shared certain characteristics that made them ideal customers for this particular market. Wealthy merchants who had made their fortunes in trade and wanted to display their success through exotic acquisitions. Government officials who saw male concubines as both personal pleasure and political tools. Military commanders who viewed them as rewards for their service to the empire. And of course, the imperial court itself, where male concubines were collected like rare artworks, each one a testament to the collector's refined tastes and unlimited resources. What made these markets particularly revolting was their matter-of-fact efficiency. There were established procedures for everything, from the initial inspection to the final sale. Contracts were drawn up detailing the terms of purchase, including guarantees about the boy's health and virgin status. Payment was typically made in silver, though sometimes goods or services were exchanged instead. The paperwork was filed with local authorities, making the transaction completely legal and above board. The boys themselves had no voice in any of this. They stood silent and terrified while strangers discussed their future as if they were inanimate objects. Many were too young to fully understand what was happening to them, knowing only that they were being separated from their families and handed over to people who looked at them with a hunger that made their skin crawl. The lucky ones were too shocked to process the reality of their situation. The unlucky ones understood exactly what was being done to them and could do nothing but watch it happen. Once purchased, the boys were immediately subjected to a process that can only be described as systematic dehumanization. Their names were often changed or discarded entirely, replaced with designations that reflected their new status as property. They were given new clothes, usually silk garments that emphasized their youth and beauty, while making them easily identifiable as concubines. Their hair was styled in specific ways that marked them as belonging to their new master, and they were taught to walk, talk, and behave in manners that pleased their owner. The training period was where the real horror began. Professional trainers, men who had made careers out of breaking young spirits, took charge of conditioning the newly purchased boys for their roles. These weren't sadistic amateurs taking pleasure in cruelty, though pleasure certainly played a part. They were skilled professionals who understood human psychology well enough to systematically dismantle a child's sense of self and rebuild it according to their master's specifications. The process started with isolation. Boys were separated from anything familiar, cut off from their old identities, and forced to exist in a world where their previous experiences had no meaning. They were given new rules to follow, rules that made no sense except as exercises in submission. They might be required to stand in specific positions for hours at a time, or to repeat meaningless phrases until their voices gave out, or to perform humiliating tasks that served no purpose except to demonstrate their powerlessness. Physical conditioning was equally important. The boys' bodies were modified to better serve their intended purpose, and these modifications went far beyond simple grooming. Diets were carefully controlled to maintain the soft, youthful appearance that was prized in male concubines. Exercise was limited to prevent the development of muscle mass that might make them appear too masculine. Their skin was treated with various substances to keep it smooth and pale, and their body hair was regularly removed to maintain a prepubescent appearance even as they grew older. But the most invasive modifications were surgical. Many male concubines underwent procedures designed to alter their anatomy in ways that would make them more appealing to their masters or better suited to their intended roles. These operations were performed without anesthesia by practitioners who had learned their skills through trial and error, with predictably horrific results. The mortality rate was significant, but this was considered an acceptable cost of doing business. The psychological conditioning was perhaps even more devastating than the physical modifications. Trainers used techniques that would be recognized today as sophisticated forms of brainwashing, designed to break down the boys' resistance and rebuild their personalities from the ground up. They were taught to view themselves as inherently worthless, except as sources of pleasure for their masters. They were conditioned to feel grateful for any small kindness while accepting abuse as their natural lot in life. The training process typically lasted several months, during which the boys were gradually introduced to their duties and responsibilities. They learned to read their master's moods and anticipate his needs. They were taught various skills that would make them more valuable, from music and poetry to massage and other intimate services. Most importantly, they learned to suppress their own desires and emotions, becoming perfect mirrors that reflected only what their masters wanted to see. Those who showed promise during training were given additional instruction in more specialized skills. Some became accomplished musicians or dancers, able to provide entertainment at social gatherings. Others were trained in the arts of conversation and companionship, serving as confidants and advisors to their masters. The most intelligent might even be taught to read and write, though this education was always carefully limited to prevent them from developing too much independence. The boys who struggled with the conditioning process faced increasingly harsh consequences. Physical punishment was common, ranging from beatings to more creative forms of torture designed to break their will without permanently damaging their market value. Those who proved completely resistant to training were sometimes sold to less discerning buyers or simply disposed of entirely. The trainers couldn't afford to waste time on boys who would never become properly compliant. By the end of the training period, the transformation was usually complete. The frightened child who had been sold at market had been replaced by a hollow shell programmed to serve and please. They had learned to smile when they felt like crying, to express gratitude when they felt rage, and to find their entire sense of worth in their master's approval. They had become, in every meaningful sense, exactly what their purchasers had paid for. The successful completion of training marked the beginning of their service period, but it was hardly the end of their suffering. If anything, the worst was yet to come, as they discovered what their new life would actually entail on a day-to-day basis. The training had prepared them for submission, but nothing could really prepare them for the reality of existing as another person's sexual property, available at any hour of the day or night to satisfy desires they found revolting. And perhaps most tragically of all, many of these boys came to believe that this was indeed their natural state, that they had been born to serve in this capacity, and that any dreams of a different life were not just impossible, but actually wrong. The conditioning had worked so well that they became willing participants in their own degradation, unable to imagine any other existence, and terrified of losing the only identity they had been allowed to keep. The market for male concubines created its own ecosystem of supporting industries and services. Doctors specialized in treating the various health problems that arose from the lifestyle. Merchants sold the specific clothing, cosmetics, and accessories that were required. Trainers developed increasingly sophisticated methods for breaking and conditioning new acquisitions. And all of this operated openly, with the full knowledge and approval of society at large. The boys caught in this system were not just victims of individual cruelty, but casualties of an entire civilization that had decided their suffering was acceptable, even admirable. They were sacrificed on the altar of other people's pleasure and status, their lives considered less valuable than the temporary satisfaction they could provide to their owners. And the most damning part of all was that this wasn't seen as a tragedy or a crime, but as a perfectly normal part of how society functioned. The daily existence of a male concubine was a carefully orchestrated nightmare that began before dawn and continued until their master's last whim was satisfied. These weren't lives in any meaningful sense of the word. They were performances, elaborate theater productions where the actors had forgotten they were playing roles and had come to believe the script was reality itself. Every moment was choreographed, every gesture monitored, every breath taken only with the implicit permission of someone who owned them more completely than any slave owner had ever owned human property. The morning routine started with ritual humiliation disguised as grooming. Male concubines were awakened by servants who treated them with a mixture of contempt and pity, knowing full well what these boys were being prepared for. The bathing process alone could take hours, involving perfumed waters, oils, and treatments designed to maintain the artificial softness that their masters demanded. Their skin had to be perfect, without blemish or hair, smooth as polished jade, and just as cold to the touch. But it wasn't just about cleanliness. The bathing ritual served as a daily reminder of their status as objects rather than people. They were scrubbed and oiled by strangers who handled their bodies with the same casual indifference they might show to a piece of furniture being prepared for display. There was no privacy, no dignity, no recognition of basic human modesty. They were property being maintained, nothing more. The clothing they wore was perhaps the most visible symbol of their degradation. Male concubines were dressed in garments specifically designed to emphasize their youth and availability, while simultaneously marking them as different from normal men. The fabrics were fine, often silk or other expensive materials, but the cuts were deliberately feminizing. Colors were chosen not for the wearer's preference, but for their master's pleasure, usually soft pastels or bright hues that would never be worn by a free man. Even more disturbing was how these clothes were designed to provide easy access for their master's use. Hidden openings, strategically placed ties, garments that could be removed or adjusted quickly and quietly. The boys learned to dress themselves in ways that facilitated their own exploitation, their fingers becoming expert at fastenings that would soon be undone by hands that had no right to touch them. The psychological conditioning extended to every aspect of their appearance. Male concubines were taught to move in specific ways, to hold their bodies in positions that advertised their availability, while suggesting submission. They learned to walk with shorter steps, to keep their eyes downcast unless specifically instructed otherwise, to arrange their hands and arms in poses that their masters found appealing. Even their facial expressions were controlled, trained to display the perfect combination of innocence and invitation that drove their owners to distraction. Meals were another opportunity for humiliation and control. Male concubines often ate from special dishes, sometimes fed by hand like pets or children. Their diets were carefully monitored, not for health, but for aesthetic purposes. Foods that might alter their scent or taste were forbidden. Portions were controlled to maintain their slender, boyish figures. They were taught to eat delicately, to savor each bite as if it were a gift from their master rather than basic sustenance they had every right to expect. The power dynamics around food were particularly twisted. Many masters took pleasure in hand-feeding their concubines, treating grown boys like infants, while simultaneously using the intimacy of the act to reinforce their dominance. Others withheld food as punishment or provided special treats as rewards, creating a system where basic nutrition became contingent on good behavior and sexual compliance. Between meals, male concubines were expected to remain available and entertaining. This didn't just mean being ready for sexual use, though that was certainly part of it. They were living decorations, expected to provide pleasant background ambiance for their master's daily activities. They might be required to play music while their owner conducted business, to provide silent companionship during meals, or simply to pose attractively in corners like expensive statuary. The boredom was almost as crushing as the abuse. These boys, many of whom had been intelligent and curious children before their capture, were reduced to waiting for their master to want something from them, waiting for permission to move or speak or even think. Their minds, once filled with dreams and possibilities, became empty vessels, focused only on anticipating and fulfilling someone else's desires. Educational activities, when they existed at all, were carefully designed to increase their value rather than expand their horizons. A concubine might be taught to read, but only poetry that pleased his master. He might learn music, but only songs that enhanced romantic encounters. Any knowledge that might lead to independent thinking or self-awareness was strictly forbidden. They were being trained to be perfect pleasure objects, not human beings. The most devastating part of their daily routine was the constant performance of gratitude. Male concubines were required to express appreciation for everything done to them, no matter how degrading or painful. They thanked their masters for the privilege of serving them. They smiled while being violated. They competed with each other for the honor of being chosen for particularly humiliating tasks. The psychological conditioning was so complete that many genuinely felt grateful for treatment that should have inspired only rage and revulsion. Social interactions were carefully controlled and monitored. Male concubines were rarely allowed to form genuine friendships with each other, as such relationships might provide emotional support that could undermine their dependence on their masters. When they were permitted to interact, it was usually in competitive situations designed to pit them against each other for their owner's favor. They learned to see other concubines not as fellow victims, but as rivals who might steal the affection and attention they desperately needed to survive. The isolation was profound and intentional. Cut off from their families, prevented from forming meaningful relationships with peers, and denied any connection to the outside world, male concubines existed in a bubble where their master's household was the entire universe. They lost touch with normal human society, forgetting what healthy relationships look like, or even that such things were possible. Evening activities were when the true horror of their situation became most apparent. As daylight faded and the household settled into its private routines, male concubines knew they would be called upon to perform the services for which they had been purchased. There was no refusing, no negotiating, no expressing preferences or boundaries. They were expected to be enthusiastic participants in their own degradation, to act as if nothing in the world could bring them greater joy than satisfying their master's sexual appetites. The physical abuse they endured was compounded by the emotional manipulation that accompanied it. Masters often insisted that their concubines express love and desire during these encounters, turning rape into a twisted parody of romance. The boys learned to fake passion so convincingly that they sometimes forgot they were acting, their minds protecting them by dissociating from the reality of what was happening to their bodies. Sleep, when it finally came, offered little respite. Male concubines often slept in their master's quarters, available for use at any hour of the night. They learned to remain motionless and silent, even while unconscious, knowing that disturbing their owner's rest could result in severe punishment. Their dreams, when they dared to have them, were filled with memories of the families and lives they had lost, ghosts of the children they had once been, before the world decided their suffering was acceptable entertainment. The psychological techniques used to maintain control over male concubines were sophisticated forms of manipulation that would be recognized today as systematic abuse. Masters employed intermittent reinforcement, providing just enough kindness and affection to keep their concubines emotionally dependent while never allowing them to feel truly secure or valued. They created artificial scarcity around basic human needs like affection, privacy, and autonomy, making their concubines grateful for tiny concessions that should have been fundamental rights. Perhaps most insidiously, masters often convinced their concubines that they were special, chosen, different from other boys who might be sold into slavery or left to starve on the streets. This false sense of privilege made it harder for the boys to recognize their situation as abuse, instead viewing it as a form of protection or even love. They were taught to see themselves as fortunate rather than victimized, blessed rather than cursed. The medical care provided to male concubines reflected their status as valuable property rather than human beings deserving of compassion. Doctors were called when their health affected their usefulness or attractiveness, but suffering that didn't impact their performance was generally ignored. Many developed chronic pain from the physical modifications they had undergone, but pain relief was rarely provided unless it interfered with their duties. Mental health was an even lower priority. The depression, anxiety, and trauma that inevitably resulted from their treatment were seen as character flaws rather than natural responses to abuse. Concubines who showed signs of emotional distress were often punished for their ingratitude rather than helped through their pain. The message was clear. Their feelings mattered only insofar as they affected their ability to please their masters. The seasonal rhythms of life took on different meanings for male concubines. Spring brought anxiety about being displayed at social gatherings where their master might show them off to friends and rivals. Summer meant longer days of availability and often increased sexual demands. Autumn was a time of uncertainty, as masters sometimes decided to trade or sell concubines who no longer held their interest. Winter offered the false comfort of indoor confinement, but also the claustrophobia of being trapped in close quarters with their abusers. Religious and cultural festivals that brought joy to ordinary families became sources of dread for male concubines. These occasions often meant special performances, increased social obligations, and the presence of guests who might view them as exotic entertainment. They learned to smile and participate in celebrations that marked their continued enslavement, to express happiness about traditions that had stolen their childhoods and destroyed their futures. The aging process was particularly cruel for male concubines. As they grew older and their boyish appearance began to fade, they faced the terrifying prospect of being discarded like worn-out clothing. Some masters kept aging concubines as servants or companions, but many were simply sold to less prestigious households or abandoned entirely. The boys who had once been prized for their youth and beauty found themselves competing with newer, younger acquisitions, their value diminishing with each passing year. Those who managed to survive into their 20s often faced an identity crisis that was almost impossible to resolve. They had spent their formative years being told that their only worth lay in their ability to provide sexual pleasure to their masters. As that ability waned, they were left with no sense of who they were or what they might become. Many had been so thoroughly conditioned that they couldn't imagine existing without a master to serve, even as that same master prepared to discard them. The few who achieved positions of influence within their households often did so by becoming enforcers of the same system that had victimized them. They helped train new concubines, assisted in the selection process at markets, and served as intermediaries between their masters and the outside world. This collaboration with their oppressors was both a survival strategy and a form of Stockholm Syndrome, as they identified so completely with their captors that they became willing participants in perpetuating the cycle of abuse. The psychological damage inflicted on these boys extended far beyond their years of active service. Those who eventually gained their freedom, either through their master's death or some other circumstance, often found themselves unable to function in normal society. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to exist as objects rather than autonomous individuals that the prospect of making their own decisions and forming genuine relationships was overwhelming and terrifying. The daily reality of male concubinage was a masterpiece of systematic dehumanization designed to extract maximum pleasure and utility from human beings while destroying everything that made them human. It was a machine that consumed children and produced hollow shells, empty vessels filled only with their master's desires and expectations. And the most horrifying aspect of all was how normal it seemed to those who operated it, how easily an entire society convinced itself that this was not just acceptable but admirable, a sign of sophistication and refined taste. Tomorrow would bring more of the same for these boys, another day of performance and submission, another 24 hours of existing solely for someone else's pleasure. They would wake up in silk sheets that felt like shrouds, dress in fine clothes that marked them as property, and spend their waking hours waiting for the next opportunity to be used and degraded by the people who owned them. And through it all, they would smile and express gratitude, their minds so thoroughly broken that they had forgotten it was possible to want anything else. The modifications performed on male concubines went far beyond what most people could imagine, entering territory that would make battlefield surgeons queasy. These weren't medical procedures in any meaningful sense. They were systematic mutilations designed to transform boys into living dolls that better suited their masters' twisted fantasies. And the most chilling part? The practitioners who performed these operations saw themselves as artists, craftsmen, perfecting their trade through trial and error on the bodies of children who had no choice but to endure whatever was done to them. The process typically began within weeks of purchase, while the boys were still adjusting to their new circumstances and before they had fully grasped what their future held. Timing was crucial because younger bodies healed faster and adapted more readily to artificial changes. The modifications had to be completed before the boys reached full sexual maturity, while their features were still soft and malleable enough to be permanently altered. The most common procedure was what practitioners euphemistically called smoothing, a process that involved the removal of body hair and the prevention of its future growth. This wasn't simple shaving or plucking. It involved the systematic destruction of hair follicles through various methods, including the application of caustic substances that burned away the roots, hot metal tools that seared the skin, and primitive forms of electrolysis that sent agonizing jolts through the boys' bodies. The goal was to maintain a prepubescent appearance indefinitely, freezing them in a state of artificial youth that would never naturally fade. The pain was indescribable. Boys were held down by multiple assistants while practitioners worked methodically across their entire bodies, destroying every trace of hair that might suggest masculine maturity. The process took days to complete, with breaks only when the subjects lost consciousness from the agony. There was no anesthesia, no pain relief, no consideration for the psychological trauma being inflicted alongside the physical torture. The boys screamed until their voices gave out, then continued screaming silently until their minds retreated into protective numbness. But hair removal was just the beginning. Many concubines underwent procedures designed to alter their facial features, making them appear more feminine or simply more appealing to their specific master's tastes. Noses were reshaped through repeated breaking and resetting. Lips were enhanced through various methods, including the injection of substances that caused permanent swelling. Eyebrows were plucked into unnatural shapes and prevented from regrowing. Even teeth were sometimes filed or pulled to create different smile patterns that their owners found more attractive. The most invasive modifications targeted the boys' genitals, altering them in ways that served their master's preferences while ensuring they could never function as normal men. Some procedures were designed to prevent the development of adult sexual characteristics, essentially chemically castrating the boys through the destruction of their reproductive organs. Others involved physical alterations that made certain sexual acts easier or more pleasurable for their masters, while causing ongoing pain and dysfunction for the concubines themselves. These genital modifications were performed with instruments that were barely more sophisticated than kitchen knives, by practitioners whose only training came from watching others perform the same mutilations. The mortality rate was staggering, with many boys dying from infection, blood loss, or shock during or shortly after the procedures. Those who survived often faced lifelong complications, chronic pain, and the psychological devastation of knowing they had been permanently altered to better serve as sexual objects. The recovery period was its own form of torture. Boys were kept immobilized for weeks while their wounds healed, often developing infections that turned minor procedures into life-threatening ordeals. They were fed special diets designed to promote healing while maintaining their desired appearance, force-fed medicines that tasted like poison and often were nearly as toxic. The isolation during recovery was profound, lying alone in pain with nothing to do but contemplate what had been done to them and what their future held. Some modifications were purely aesthetic, designed to enhance features that their masters found appealing. Skin was treated with various substances to maintain an artificial paleness that was prized in concubines. Feet were sometimes bound or altered to create different shapes, following fashion trends that treated human bodies like clay to be molded according to artistic whim. Hands were kept soft through the application of oils and the prevention of any manual labor that might callous them. The psychological impact of these modifications was perhaps even more devastating than the physical trauma. Boys who underwent these procedures were forced to confront the reality that their bodies no longer belonged to them in any meaningful sense. They had been permanently altered to serve someone else's pleasure, marked and modified like livestock. The knowledge that they could never be normal again, that they would carry these artificial changes for the rest of their lives, was a form of psychological poison that corrupted their sense of self at the deepest level. Many practitioners specialized in specific types of modifications, developing reputations for particular skills that commanded premium prices. Some were known for their ability to alter facial features without leaving obvious scars. Others were sought out for their expertise in genital modifications that achieved specific effects. The most skilled could perform multiple procedures simultaneously, efficiently transforming a boy's entire appearance in a single session that might last for days. The tools used for these modifications were crude but effective, designed more for function than for minimizing pain or trauma. Sharp knives for cutting, hot irons for cauterizing, various chemical substances for burning or dissolving tissue. Some practitioners used mechanical devices that could apply precise pressure or tension to gradually reshape bone and cartilage over time. All of these instruments were used on conscious subjects who could feel every cut, every burn, every moment of the process. The apprenticeship system for learning these techniques was particularly disturbing. Young men, often former concubines themselves, were trained in the art of modification by watching and assisting with procedures on newer victims. They learned to hold down struggling boys, to ignore their screams and pleas, to view the subjects as raw material rather than human beings. This created a cycle where victims became perpetrators, ensuring the continuation of practices that they themselves had once endured. Quality control was maintained through a system of reputation and repeat business. Masters who were dissatisfied with the results of modifications could demand refunds or additional procedures at no cost. This created pressure on practitioners to achieve consistent results, leading to increasingly refined techniques that caused maximum alteration with minimum visible scarring. The boy's welfare was never part of the equation except insofar as dead or permanently damaged concubines represented lost profits. Some modifications were reversible, designed to be temporary alterations that could be adjusted as masters' preferences changed. Others were permanent, irreversible changes that would mark the boys for life, even if they somehow gained their freedom. The psychological impact of permanent modifications was particularly severe, as boys realized they would never be able to escape the visual reminders of what had been done to them. The medical knowledge required for these procedures was surprisingly sophisticated, passed down through generations of practitioners who had learned through experimentation on countless victims. They understood anatomy well enough to perform complex alterations while keeping their subjects alive and functional. They knew which cuts would heal cleanly and which would leave attractive scars. They could predict how different bodies would respond to various treatments and adjust their techniques accordingly. Recovery from modifications often required additional procedures to address complications or achieve desired effects that weren't accomplished in the initial surgery. Boys might undergo multiple sessions over months or years, each one adding new trauma to bodies that were still healing from previous alterations. The cumulative effect was devastating, creating physical and psychological damage that compounded with each intervention. The timing of modifications was carefully planned to coincide with the boys' training and conditioning. Physical alterations were often performed during periods of intense psychological pressure when the subjects were most vulnerable and least likely to resist. The pain and trauma of the procedures were used as additional tools for breaking their spirits, demonstrating their powerlessness and their master's absolute control over their bodies. Some boys tried to resist the modification process, fighting against the assistants who held them down or refusing to cooperate with recovery instructions. These acts of defiance were met with increasingly severe punishments that made the original procedures seem mild by comparison. Resistance was systematically crushed through additional pain and humiliation, until even the strongest-willed boys learned to submit passively to whatever was done to them. The long-term health consequences of these modifications were rarely considered by the practitioners who performed them. Boys might develop chronic infections, ongoing pain, or functional disabilities that affected them for the rest of their lives. But as long as they remained useful to their masters in the short term, these future problems were seen as acceptable costs of doing business. The integration of modified concubines back into their masters' households required careful management to ensure they adapted properly to their altered bodies and new capabilities. Special clothing might be required to accommodate physical changes. New routines had to be established to maintain the results of procedures. The boys had to learn to move and behave in ways that worked with their modified anatomy while still fulfilling their assigned roles. Perhaps most tragically, many boys eventually came to view their modifications as improvements, signs that they were valued enough for their masters to invest in enhancing their appearance. The psychological conditioning was so complete that they learned to take pride in alterations that had been forced upon them, seeing their mutilated bodies as evidence of their special status rather than symbols of their victimization. The modifications performed on male concubines represented the ultimate expression of treating human beings as objects to be customized according to the owner's preferences. They demonstrated the complete disregard for bodily autonomy, human dignity, and basic medical ethics that characterized the entire system of concubinage. These procedures weren't aberrations or extremes, but standard practices that were considered normal and necessary parts of preparing boys for their intended roles. The practitioners who performed these modifications saw themselves as providing valuable services to their clients, improving the quality and appearance of their human property through skilled craftsmanship. They took pride in their work, competed with each other for reputation and clientele, and passed down their techniques to the next generation as if they were legitimate medical knowledge rather than systematic torture methods. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the boys who survived these modifications often went on to live for years or decades with their altered bodies, constant reminders of what had been done to them and what they had been reduced to. They carried the physical scars of their mutilation alongside the psychological wounds that never fully healed, living testaments to a system that viewed their suffering as not just acceptable, but necessary for the pleasure and satisfaction of their owners. The modification process was the point at which boys truly ceased to be human beings in any meaningful sense, and became instead customized objects designed for their master's use. It was the moment when any pretense of care or concern for their welfare was abandoned in favor of pure utilitarian calculation. And it was performed not by monsters hiding in shadows, but by respected members of society who saw nothing wrong with permanently altering children's bodies to make them better suited for sexual slavery. The housing arrangements for male concubines were designed with the same meticulous attention to control and degradation that characterized every other aspect of their existence. These weren't bedrooms or living quarters in any normal sense. They were elaborate cages disguised as luxury accommodations, spaces that appeared opulent on the surface while functioning as sophisticated instruments of psychological torture and physical control. The typical concubine quarters were located within the master's residence, but carefully separated from areas where family members or respectable guests might accidentally encounter them. This physical isolation served multiple purposes. It kept the concubines hidden from public view when discretion was required, prevented them from forming relationships with household staff who might develop sympathetic feelings, and created a sense of existing in a separate world where normal social rules didn't apply. The rooms themselves were paradoxes of comfort and confinement. Furnished with expensive silks, soft cushions, and decorative objects that spoke to their master's wealth and refined taste, they might have appeared luxurious to an outside observer. But every element was chosen not for the occupant's comfort, but for their owner's pleasure. The colors were selected to complement the concubine's appearance. The furniture was arranged to provide optimal viewing angles for masters who enjoyed watching their property. Even the lighting was designed to be flattering rather than functional. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist in these spaces. Walls were often designed with hidden openings that allowed masters to observe their concubines without being seen. Some rooms featured one-way viewing panels disguised as decorative screens or mirrors. Others had acoustic properties that carried sound to listening posts in adjacent chambers. The boys learned to assume they were being watched and overheard at all times, even during their most intimate and vulnerable moments. The sleeping arrangements were particularly degrading. Many concubines were required to sleep on the floor rather than in beds, either on thin mats or piles of cushions that could be easily moved or removed as punishment. This served to reinforce their status as property rather than people, while also ensuring they remained physically accessible to their masters at all hours. Beds, when they were provided, were often designed more for their master's convenience than for the concubine's rest. Bathing facilities were another area where the illusion of luxury masked a reality of control and humiliation. Elaborate bathing chambers with expensive fixtures and perfumed waters might seem indulgent, but they were designed to facilitate the grooming and preparation rituals that kept the concubines in a constant state of readiness for use. The bathing process itself was often performed by servants, or sometimes by the masters themselves, turning basic hygiene into an opportunity for violation and dominance. Storage of personal belongings was strictly controlled and limited. Concubines were rarely allowed to keep items from their previous lives, and any possessions they accumulated during their service were subject to their master's approval and could be removed at any time. This prevented them from developing attachments to objects that might provide comfort or remind them of their humanity. Their entire material existence was curated to serve their master's aesthetic preferences rather than their own needs or desires. The temperature and lighting in concubine quarters were often manipulated as forms of control. Rooms might be kept uncomfortably warm to encourage minimal clothing, or uncomfortably cool to create dependence on their masters for warmth and comfort. Lighting could be dimmed or brightened according to the master's mood or the activities planned for the space. Even basic environmental comfort became a privilege that could be granted or withdrawn as a form of reward or punishment. Ventilation was frequently poor, creating stuffy, oppressive atmospheres that contributed to the sense of confinement and unreality that pervaded these spaces. The stale air, heavy with incense and perfumes, created an artificial environment that felt removed from the natural world. This sensory isolation was intentional, designed to make the concubines feel as if they existed in a separate reality where their masters were the only source of light, air, and life itself. The decoration of these rooms often included artwork and objects that reinforced the concubines' roles and status. Paintings might depict scenes of submission or service. Sculptures could emphasize themes of youth and beauty. Books, when they were present at all, were carefully selected to promote appropriate attitudes and behaviors. Every visual element served as a constant reminder of what the occupants were expected to be and do. Security measures were integrated seamlessly into the design of these spaces. Doors might lock from the outside but not from within. Windows, if they existed at all, were often barred or positioned too high to provide views of the outside world. Some rooms were designed with only one entrance, making escape impossible and ensuring that the master controlled all access to and from the space. The architecture itself became a prison, beautiful and comfortable, but absolutely inescapable. The acoustic properties of concubine quarters were carefully considered to serve their master's purposes. Some rooms were soundproofed to prevent screams or other disturbing noises from being heard by outsiders. Others were designed to carry sound to specific locations where masters could listen to their property's private conversations or intimate moments. The boys learned to moderate their voices and behavior at all times, never knowing who might be listening or what consequences their words might bring. Maintenance of these spaces was performed by specially selected servants who understood the need for discretion and had been conditioned to view the concubines as objects rather than people. These servants often showed more concern for the furniture and decorations than for the human beings who occupied the rooms. They cleaned around the concubines as if they were part of the decor, maintaining the spaces without acknowledging the humanity of their occupants. The psychological impact of these living arrangements was profound and intentional. By surrounding the concubines with luxury while simultaneously imprisoning them, masters created a form of cognitive dissonance that made it difficult for their victims to understand their situation clearly. The boys were taught to feel grateful for their beautiful surroundings while remaining acutely aware that they were prisoners who could be moved, sold, or disposed of at their master's whim. Seasonal changes in these quarters were often dramatic, reflecting their master's moods and preferences rather than practical considerations. Rooms might be completely redecorated to match new aesthetic trends or to accommodate different types of activities. Concubines learned to adapt quickly to changing environments, never becoming too attached to any particular arrangement, since everything could be altered without notice or consultation. The lighting in these spaces was particularly manipulative, designed to create specific moods and atmospheres that served their master's purposes. Soft, romantic lighting might be used to create intimacy during certain activities. Harsh, bright illumination could be employed to facilitate inspection and grooming. Some masters enjoyed dramatic lighting effects that turned their concubines into living artworks, posed and displayed like sculptures in a gallery. Heating and cooling systems, where they existed, were often controlled from outside the rooms, giving masters another tool for managing their property's comfort and behavior. Concubines might find themselves shivering in deliberately cooled spaces until they pleased their masters enough to earn the privilege of warmth. Alternatively, stifling heat might be used to encourage minimal clothing or create physical discomfort that made the boys more compliant and eager to please. The furnishings in these rooms were selected not for durability or comfort, but for their ability to facilitate the activities that took place there. Cushions and mats could be easily arranged and rearranged for different purposes. Furniture was often designed to restrain or position occupants in specific ways. Even decorative objects might serve dual purposes, appearing innocent while actually functioning as tools for control or punishment. Mirrors were commonly installed in concubine quarters, but not for the occupant's vanity. These reflective surfaces allowed masters to observe their property from multiple angles and forced the concubines to constantly confront their own image, reinforcing their role as objects to be looked at rather than human beings with inner lives and autonomous thoughts. The psychological impact of constant self-observation was devastating, creating a form of perpetual performance anxiety that never allowed for genuine relaxation or privacy. The integration of these living spaces into the larger household required careful planning to ensure that concubines remained hidden from inappropriate viewers while remaining accessible to their masters. Separate entrances and passages were often constructed to allow discreet movement between the concubine quarters and the master's private rooms. These hidden pathways reinforce the secretive nature of the relationship while providing practical access for nighttime visits and other private encounters. Food service to these quarters was another opportunity for control and humiliation. Meals were often delivered by servants who treated the concubines with visible contempt, reinforcing their low status within the household hierarchy. The timing, quantity, and quality of food could be adjusted as rewards or punishments, making even basic nutrition contingent on satisfactory performance and behavior. The psychological architecture of these spaces was as important as their physical design. Every element was chosen to reinforce the concubines' dependence on their masters, while gradually eroding their sense of self and autonomy. The beautiful prison that surrounded them became internalized, creating mental barriers that were often more effective than physical ones in preventing escape or resistance. The clothing and adornment of male concubines represented perhaps the most visible manifestation of their objectification, transforming them into living dolls, dressed according to their master's fantasies, rather than any consideration for comfort, dignity, or personal preference. Every thread, every accessory, every detail of their appearance was chosen not by them, but for them, turning their bodies into canvases upon which their owners painted their desires and displayed their wealth. The fabrics alone told a story of contradiction and control. While concubines were draped in the finest silks, most expensive brocades, and rarest imported materials, these luxurious textiles served as gilded chains rather than genuine comfort. The silk was chosen for how it felt against their master's hands, not against their own skin. The colors were selected to complement their complexion in candlelight, not because they found them beautiful or meaningful. Every garment was a costume in a performance they never auditioned for and could never leave. The cuts and styles of concubine clothing were deliberately designed to emphasize youth and availability, while minimizing any suggestion of masculine authority or independence. Robes were tailored to cling in certain places while flowing loosely in others, creating silhouettes that pleased their owners while making normal movement awkward and unnatural. Sleeves were often so long and flowing that they required careful management to avoid tripping or knocking over objects, creating a constant need for graceful, deliberate movement that reinforced their role as decorative objects. The process of dressing each morning was itself a form of ritual humiliation that could take hours to complete. Concubines were not allowed to dress themselves, instead standing passive as servants layered garment after garment according to precise instructions left by their masters. Every fold had to be perfect, every sash tied in exactly the right manner, every ornament placed with mathematical precision. The boys learned to remain motionless like mannequins while being manipulated and arranged by hands that showed no more consideration for their comfort than they would for a piece of furniture being positioned. Undergarments, when they were provided at all, were designed more for their master's convenience than for the wearer's needs. Some concubines were required to wear nothing beneath their outer robes, leaving them constantly aware of their vulnerability and accessibility. Others were provided with specially designed garments that could be easily removed or adjusted without disturbing the outer layers of clothing. The psychological impact of this intimate control was devastating, creating a constant awareness that their bodies were not their own, even in the most private aspects of dress. The seasonal wardrobe changes were elaborate productions that reinforced the concubine's status as property to be maintained and displayed. As weather changed, their entire appearance would be transformed according to their master's preferences for different times of year. Spring might bring lighter fabrics in pastel shades that emphasized their youth and innocence. Summer could mean even more revealing garments that showcased their carefully maintained physiques. Autumn often featured richer colors and textures that created a sense of maturity and sophistication. Winter brought heavier fabrics that still managed to suggest warmth and intimacy rather than practical protection from the cold. The accessories worn by male concubines were perhaps even more degrading than their clothing, serving as visible markers of their status, while often functioning as subtle restraints or tools of control. Jewelry was not chosen for its beauty or the wearer's preference, but for its ability to mark ownership and enhance attractiveness to their masters. Delicate chains might connect different pieces, creating the illusion of ornamentation while actually limiting movement. Bracelets could be designed to chime softly when the wearer moved, ensuring they could never approach their masters unheard. Hair ornaments were particularly significant in the concubine's ensemble, often serving as status symbols that indicated their position within their master's collection. More favored concubines might be adorned with precious gems and intricate metalwork, while those who had fallen from grace wore simpler decorations or none at all. The process of having their hair arranged was another daily reminder of their powerlessness, as they sat motionless while servants twisted and pinned their locks according to styles chosen entirely by others. Footwear, when it was provided, was selected for aesthetic rather than practical purposes. Soft slippers that made no sound when walking, ensuring the concubines could move about without disturbing their masters, unless specifically summoned. The soles were often thin and delicate, making walking on rough surfaces uncomfortable and reinforcing their dependence on remaining within the controlled environment of their masters' households. Some concubines were required to go barefoot entirely, their feet kept soft and pale through careful grooming that made them unsuitable for any practical activity. The makeup and cosmetics applied to male concubines transformed their natural features into artificial masks designed to appeal to their masters' tastes. Powder was used to maintain the pale complexion that was prized in court circles, applied so thickly that their natural skin tone disappeared entirely. Rouge was carefully applied to create the illusion of youth and health, even when the concubines were exhausted or ill. Their eyes were outlined and enhanced with pigments that made them appear larger and more innocent, while their lips were painted to suggest both purity and invitation. The application of these cosmetics was a daily ritual that could take hours to complete, performed by skilled servants who treated the concubines' faces like canvases to be painted rather than human features to be enhanced. The boys learned to sit perfectly still during this process, barely breathing as brushes and powders transformed them into the artificial beings their masters desired. The weight and texture of the makeup became another constant reminder of their artificial status, the way it felt on their skin, serving as a physical manifestation of the false identity that had been imposed upon them. Perfumes and scented oils were applied liberally to concubine clothing and bodies, creating artificial fragrances that masked their natural human scent. These perfumes were chosen not for the wearer's preferences, but to appeal to their master's tastes, often so strong and cloying that they became nauseating to the concubines themselves. The scent followed them everywhere, creating an olfactory prison that made it impossible for them to forget their role even for a moment. The maintenance of these elaborate appearances required constant attention and frequent replacement of garments that were often damaged or soiled during their use. Concubines learned to move with extreme care to avoid staining or tearing their clothing, knowing that any damage might result in punishment or replacement with less attractive garments. The fear of ruining their appearance became another form of psychological control, creating anxiety about every movement and interaction. Special occasion clothing took the objectification to even greater extremes, with garments designed specifically for particular activities or events. Some outfits were created solely for their master's private viewing, featuring cuts and decorations that would be scandalous in public, but served to enhance the concubine's appeal in intimate settings. Others were designed for display at social gatherings, turning the wearers into living advertisements for their master's wealth and refined taste. The process of changing between these different outfits became another opportunity for humiliation and control. Concubines were required to model new garments for their master's approval, standing and turning while being examined like merchandise. Comments about their appearance in different outfits became part of their conditioning, teaching them to value themselves only in terms of how pleasing they appeared to others, rather than developing any sense of personal aesthetic preference or individual style. The psychological impact of this constant costuming was profound and intentional. By controlling every aspect of their appearance, masters stripped away their concubines' ability to express individual identity or personal taste. The boys learned to see themselves only as reflections of their master's desires, losing touch with any sense of who they might have been or wanted to become. Their reflection in mirrors showed them not themselves, but the artificial beings they had been transformed into. The economic aspect of maintaining these elaborate wardrobes was staggering, with some masters spending fortunes on clothing and accessories for their concubines. This investment served multiple purposes beyond mere display of wealth. It created a sense of the concubine's value as property, while simultaneously increasing their master's psychological investment in maintaining control over them. The more money spent on their appearance, the more determined masters became to extract maximum value from their investment. The storage and care of concubine clothing required specialized facilities and staff, creating an entire support system devoted to maintaining their artificial appearances. Servants were trained in the proper handling of delicate fabrics, the application of cosmetics, and the arrangement of accessories. These support staff often showed more concern for the clothing than for the human beings wearing it, treating the concubines as inconvenient obstacles to their primary job of maintaining expensive textiles and ornaments. The social signaling embedded in concubine clothing was complex and multi-layered, communicating not just their master's wealth, but also their tastes, preferences, and position within elite society. Other members of the upper class could read these visual cues like a language, understanding the subtle messages conveyed by fabric choices, color combinations, and accessory selections. The concubines themselves became walking billboards for their master's status and sophistication. The physical discomfort caused by many of these garments was considered irrelevant compared to their visual impact. Tight-fitting clothes that restricted breathing, heavy ornaments that caused neck and back pain, shoes that made walking difficult. All of these were acceptable trade-offs for achieving the desired aesthetic effect. The concubine's comfort was never a consideration in clothing selection, only their appearance and their master's satisfaction with that appearance. The transformation from street clothes worn during their previous lives to the elaborate costumes of concubinage marked a symbolic death and rebirth for these boys. The simple, practical garments of their childhoods were discarded and replaced with the ornate trappings of their new roles. This clothing change was often one of the first steps in their conditioning, a visible reminder that their old identities had been stripped away and replaced with artificial personas designed to serve others' pleasure. The laundering and maintenance of concubine clothing was itself a significant undertaking, requiring specialized knowledge and expensive materials. Silk garments needed careful handling to avoid damage, while the removal of cosmetics and perfumes from fabrics required particular techniques. The complexity of maintaining these wardrobes created additional dependencies, as concubines could never care for their own clothing and remained reliant on others for every aspect of their appearance. The evolution of fashion trends in concubine clothing reflected broader changes in elite tastes and preferences, with masters competing to dress their property in the latest styles. This created a constant pressure to update and replace garments, ensuring that the concubines' appearances remained current and impressive to their masters' social circles. The boys themselves had no voice in these fashion decisions, watching passively as their appearance was altered to match changing trends they had no interest in following. The gendered nature of much concubine clothing created additional psychological trauma for boys who were forced to wear garments that violated their sense of masculine identity. While not overtly feminine, many of these clothes incorporated elements traditionally associated with women's dress, creating a deliberate ambiguity that served their masters' purposes while further confusing the wearer's sense of self and gender identity. The ritual aspects of dressing and undressing became opportunities for their masters to assert control and dominance over every aspect of their concubine's existence. Some masters insisted on personally selecting their concubine's daily attire, while others took pleasure in the process of removing these garments. The clothing became props in elaborate power games that reinforced the fundamental inequality of the relationship. The preservation of special garments for particular occasions created a hierarchy within the concubines' wardrobes that reflected their status and favor with their masters. The most beautiful and expensive outfits were reserved for moments when the concubines needed to make the strongest impression, while everyday wear was comparatively simple. This clothing hierarchy became another way of communicating approval or displeasure, with access to better garments serving as a reward for good behavior. The documentation and cataloging of concubine wardrobes was often as meticulous as the inventory of other valuable household possessions. Masters kept detailed records of clothing purchases, noting which garments were worn for what occasions and how they were received by guests or other observers. These records treated the concubines' appearances as data to be analyzed and optimized, reducing their humanity to a series of aesthetic variables that could be adjusted for maximum impact. The eventual disposal of worn or outdated concubine clothing marked another form of loss and transition in their lives. Garments that had been worn during significant moments or that held personal associations were discarded without sentiment or ceremony. The concubines learned not to form attachments to their clothing, understanding that everything about their appearance was temporary and subject to their masters' changing whims and preferences. The disposal of worn or outdated concubine clothing marked another form of loss and transition in their lives. Garments that had been worn during significant moments or that held personal associations were discarded without sentiment or ceremony. The concubines learned not to form attachments to their clothing, understanding that everything about their appearance was temporary and subject to their masters' changing whims and preferences. But the true horror of the concubine system extended far beyond individual suffering into the very fabric of Chinese society itself. What we're dealing with here isn't just isolated cases of abuse happening in dark corners. This was a cultural institution that infected every level of civilization, creating a network of complicity that reached from the imperial palace down to the poorest villages where parents calculated the market value of their own children. The normalization of this practice required the active participation of countless individuals who convinced themselves they were part of something respectable, even admirable. Doctors who performed the mutilations called themselves medical practitioners. Trainers who broke young spirits claimed to be educators. Parents who sold their sons insisted they were providing opportunities. And society as a whole developed an elaborate system of euphemisms and justifications that allowed everyone to sleep at night while children screamed behind silk curtains. The economic engine that drove this system was vast and sophisticated, creating entire industries dedicated to the commodification of human suffering. Beyond the obvious participants, there were silk merchants who specialized in concubine clothing, perfume makers who created scents specifically for the trade, furniture craftsmen who designed specialized chambers, and architects who planned buildings with hidden passages and soundproof rooms. Everyone profited except the boys whose bodies and souls were the raw materials being processed. The geographic scope was staggering. While the practice was most concentrated in major cities and imperial centers, networks of procurement extended into the remotest villages. Scouts traveled established routes, timing their visits to coincide with harvest failures, natural disasters, or other events that made families desperate enough to consider selling their children. They carried price lists that varied by region, adjusting their offers based on local economic conditions and the availability of suitable boys. The transportation of purchased concubines was itself a profitable enterprise, with specialized merchants who moved human cargo along trade routes like any other valuable commodity. These transporters developed techniques for keeping their merchandise healthy and attractive during long journeys, understanding that damaged goods would fetch lower prices at their destinations. Boys were packed into wagons like expensive pottery, cushioned enough to prevent breakage, but crowded together with no consideration for comfort or dignity. The training facilities where newly purchased boys were broken and conditioned operated like schools from hell, with established curricula, experienced instructors, and systematic approaches to destroying human individuality. These institutions had waiting lists, entrance requirements, and graduated fee structures based on the level of conditioning desired. Some specialized in basic obedience training, while others offered advanced programs that produced concubines capable of serving in the most demanding households. The medical infrastructure supporting the concubine trade was equally well developed, with practitioners who specialized in the various procedures required to transform boys into suitable products. These specialists commanded high fees for their services and often traveled between cities, following a circuit that ensured steady demand for their skills. They maintained detailed records of their techniques, constantly refining their methods to improve success rates and reduce the mortality that cut into profits. The legal framework that protected this industry was comprehensive and deliberately crafted to prevent interference from those who might object to the practice on moral grounds. Laws were written with careful language that distinguished between different types of human ownership, creating categories that made the sexual slavery of boys technically legal while maintaining the fiction that society disapproved of exploitation. Courts consistently ruled in favor of masters when disputes arose, treating concubines as property rather than victims of crime. The religious institutions that might have been expected to oppose such practices instead found ways to accommodate or even endorse them. Temples developed blessing ceremonies for new concubine purchases. Priests created prayers for the success of modifications, and religious festivals often featured displays of particularly attractive concubines as entertainment for the faithful. The spiritual authority that could have condemned this system instead legitimized it, providing divine sanction for what should have been recognized as profound evil. The educational establishment played its own role in perpetuating the system by training the next generation to view concubinage as normal and acceptable. Scholars wrote treatises on the proper selection and training of male concubines. Teachers included the practice in their discussions of household management, and philosophers developed elaborate justifications for why some human beings were naturally suited to serve others in this capacity. Knowledge that should have been used to protect children was instead weaponized against them. The artistic community found inspiration in the suffering of concubines, creating paintings, poetry, and musical compositions that romanticize their plight while ignoring the brutal reality of their existence. These cultural products helped normalize the practice by presenting it in aesthetically pleasing ways that obscured the violence and coercion involved. Beauty became complicit in horror, art serving as propaganda for a system that destroyed the very youth and innocence it claimed to celebrate. The psychological techniques used to maintain social acceptance of concubinage were as sophisticated as those used to break individual boys. Society developed collective defense mechanisms that allowed people to avoid confronting the reality of what they were supporting. The practice was hidden behind elaborate euphemisms, discussed only in coded language that obscured its true nature. When forced to acknowledge what was happening, people convinced themselves that the boys were better off as concubines than they would have been in their original circumstances. The intergenerational transmission of these attitudes ensured that each new generation grew up viewing concubinage as natural and inevitable. Children learned from their parents that some people were born to serve others in this way, that it was actually a kindness to provide boys with the opportunity to live in luxury, even if it came at the cost of their freedom and dignity. This early conditioning made it almost impossible for individuals to develop critical perspectives on the practice as they matured. The social pressure to conform was overwhelming for anyone who might have harbored doubts about the system. Questioning the morality of concubinage was seen as a sign of naivety or lack of sophistication, while participating in the trade demonstrated worldliness and success. Families that could afford concubines gained social status, while those who expressed moral objections were marginalized as unsophisticated or hypocritical. The economic incentives were structured to reward participation and punish resistance. Regions that supplied boys for the concubine trade received favorable treatment in other commercial dealings, while areas that tried to protect their children found themselves excluded from profitable relationships. Individual families faced similar pressures, with those who sold their sons often receiving opportunities for advancement that were denied to families who refused to participate. The information networks that supported the trade were extensive and efficient, spreading knowledge about market conditions, price trends, and the availability of particular types of boys across vast distances. Merchants maintained correspondence with agents in dozens of cities, creating a communication system that rivaled anything used for legitimate commerce. This infrastructure made it possible to coordinate the movement of boys from remote villages to urban markets with remarkable speed and efficiency. The standardization of practices across different regions created a consistency that made the trade more efficient and profitable. Training techniques developed in one area were quickly adopted elsewhere. Modifications that proved popular in certain markets were replicated by practitioners throughout the empire, and pricing structures became remarkably uniform despite vast geographical distances. This standardization turned what might have been isolated local practices into a coordinated system of exploitation. The insurance and financial services that developed around the concubine trade treated human beings like any other valuable commodity that might be lost or damaged. Policies were available to protect masters against the death or injury of their property, with premiums calculated based on the age, appearance, and training level of individual concubines. Banks offered loans secured by concubine collections, and investment partnerships were formed to purchase and develop promising boys for later resale. The technological innovations that emerged from the concubine trade had applications far beyond their original purpose, contributing to advances in architecture, medicine, and manufacturing that benefited society as a whole. The soundproofing techniques developed for concubine quarters were adopted for other uses. The surgical procedures created for modifications advanced general medical knowledge, and the transportation methods used for moving boys improved the efficiency of other forms of commerce. The diplomatic implications of the concubine trade affected relationships between different regions and kingdoms, with concubines often serving as gifts between rulers or as tokens of submission from conquered territories. The exchange of particularly beautiful or talented boys became part of international relations, creating obligations and alliances that influenced political decisions far removed from the original transactions. Wars were sometimes fought partly over access to populations that could supply concubines, and peace treaties often included provisions for the continued flow of boys to favored markets. The seasonal rhythms of the trade created boom and bust cycles that affected entire communities, with procurement activities concentrated during times of economic hardship when families were most likely to sell their children. Harvest failures, natural disasters, and political upheavals became opportunities for traders to expand their inventory, while periods of prosperity saw reduced supplies and higher prices. This created a perverse incentive structure where the suffering of ordinary people translated directly into increased profits for those involved in the trade. The competitive dynamics between different concubine suppliers led to innovations in both cruelty and efficiency, as traders sought to differentiate their products and capture larger market shares. Some specialized in boys from particular regions known for certain characteristics. Others focused on specific age ranges or physical types, and still others built reputations for the quality of their training and conditioning programs. This competition drove continuous refinement of techniques that increased the suffering of the boys while improving their value as commodities. The cultural exportation of concubinage practices spread the system beyond its original boundaries, as merchants and officials who had become accustomed to owning boys brought their preferences to new regions. This created demand in areas that had not previously participated in the trade, expanding the market and requiring the development of new supply chains and procurement networks. The practice became self-propagating, creating its own demand wherever it was introduced. The documentation and record-keeping associated with the concubine trade produced vast archives of information about the systematic abuse of children, written in the calm, business-like language of commercial transactions. These records, when they survive, provide horrifying insights into the scale and sophistication of the system, while demonstrating the complete dehumanization of the boys who were bought, sold, and used like any other commodity. The bureaucratic efficiency with which suffering was administered and recorded represents perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire enterprise. The resistance movements that occasionally emerged to oppose the concubine trade were systematically suppressed through a combination of legal prosecution, economic pressure, and social ostracism. Individuals who tried to rescue boys or interfere with trade operations were treated as criminals, while communities that attempted to protect their children found themselves subject to punitive measures that made cooperation seem like the only viable option. The system had developed effective immune responses to any attempts at reform or abolition. The psychological impact on society as a whole of accepting and participating in such systematic cruelty created a moral numbness that affected attitudes toward all forms of exploitation and abuse. Once people had convinced themselves that the sexual slavery of children was acceptable, it became easier to justify other forms of brutality and dehumanization. The concubine trade didn't exist in isolation, but was part of a broader culture of violence that permeated every aspect of social relations. The long-term consequences of the concubine system extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect the moral development of entire civilizations. Societies that normalized the systematic abuse of children found themselves unable to develop healthy concepts of human rights, individual dignity, or social justice. The corruption spread like a poison through every institution, creating a legacy of callousness and cruelty that persisted long after the practice itself had finally ended. And perhaps most tragically of all, the boys who survived their years as concubines often found themselves unable or unwilling to speak out against the system that had destroyed them. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept their treatment as normal and deserved that they couldn't recognize it as abuse, much less advocate for its abolition. Their silence became another weapon in the system's arsenal, allowing it to continue operating without the inconvenience of testimony from its victims about what was really happening behind those silk curtains and locked doors. The merchants who specialized in the concubine trade developed sophisticated marketing techniques that would be familiar to any modern advertiser, understanding that their success depended not just on the quality of their products, but on their ability to create and maintain demand among potential customers. They produced catalogs that described available boys in language that emphasized their youth, beauty, and potential for training, while carefully avoiding explicit descriptions of what that training would involve. These documents were works of art in their own way, combining seductive imagery with persuasive text that made the purchase of human beings seem like a natural and desirable act. The advertising campaigns they conducted were masterpieces of psychological manipulation, targeting the specific insecurities and desires of wealthy men who wanted to demonstrate their sophistication and worldliness. These weren't crude appeals to base instincts, though those certainly played a role. They were carefully crafted messages that positioned concubine ownership as a mark of cultural refinement, suggesting that only the most educated and discerning individuals could properly appreciate the subtle arts of boy training and conditioning. The seasonal marketing cycles followed predictable patterns, with major promotional pushes timed to coincide with festivals, celebrations, and other occasions when wealthy families were most likely to make substantial purchases. Spring campaigns emphasized renewal and fresh beginnings, suggesting that new concubines could revitalize households that had grown stale. Summer promotions focused on pleasure and relaxation, positioning boys as perfect companions for leisurely months. Autumn sales appealed to men preparing for the social season, while winter offers promised warmth and intimacy during the cold months ahead. The networking events that brought together concubine owners and potential buyers were elaborate social gatherings disguised as cultural salons or business meetings. These occasions allowed experienced owners to share advice with newcomers, discuss training techniques, and compare the relative merits of their collections. The boys themselves were often present at these gatherings, displayed like living artwork, while their masters engaged in conversations about their care, training, and use. The casual way these discussions took place, over fine wine and expensive food, normalize the practice while creating social pressure to participate. Regional variations in concubine preferences created specialized markets that catered to different tastes and cultural traditions. Some areas favored boys with particular physical characteristics, others prized specific skills or temperaments, and still others focused on age ranges that appealed to local aesthetics. These preferences weren't random, but reflected deeper cultural values and historical influences that shaped how different communities viewed power, sexuality, and the proper relationship between adults and children. The quality control measures implemented by successful traders ensured consistent products that met customer expectations while maintaining the reputation of their businesses. Boys were subjected to regular inspections that evaluated their physical condition, behavioral compliance, and skill development. Those who failed to meet standards were either returned for additional training or sold to less discriminating buyers at reduced prices. This systematic approach to human quality assurance treated children like manufactured goods being prepared for market. The warranty and guarantee programs offered by premium dealers provided customers with assurance that their investments were protected against defects or failures. These policies covered everything from health problems that might develop after purchase to behavioral issues that suggested inadequate training. The language used in these agreements was identical to that found in contracts for livestock or other valuable property, with detailed specifications about what constituted acceptable merchandise and what remedies were available if products failed to perform as promised. The financing options available to potential buyers made concubine ownership accessible to a broader range of customers than might otherwise have been able to participate. Payment plans allowed purchases to be spread over months or years, while lease arrangements provided temporary access to boys without the full commitment of ownership. Some dealers even offered trade-in programs that allowed customers to exchange older concubines for newer models, maintaining their collections while avoiding the complications of disposal. The maintenance services that developed around concubine ownership provided ongoing support to ensure that investments remained valuable and productive over time. Specialized physicians offered regular health checkups and treatments designed to preserve the boy's appearance and functionality. Training consultants were available to address behavioral problems or teach new skills. Even clothing and grooming services emerged to help owners maintain their property's aesthetic appeal. The insurance industry that grew up around concubine ownership treated human beings like any other valuable asset that required protection against loss or damage. Policies were available to cover theft, escape, injury, illness, and death, with premiums calculated based on the age, training level, and market value of individual boys. Claims adjusters developed expertise in evaluating concubine-related losses, while investigators specialized in tracking down escaped property and returning it to rightful owners. The social clubs and organizations that formed around concubine ownership created communities of like-minded individuals who shared common interests and experiences. These groups organized events, published newsletters, and provided forums for members to exchange information and advice. They also served as powerful lobbying forces that protected the interests of concubine owners, ensuring that laws remained favorable and that social attitudes continued to support the practice. The educational institutions that emerged to train the next generation of concubine owners and handlers provided formal instruction in what was considered a legitimate field of expertise. Students learned about selection criteria, training techniques, health maintenance, and proper care procedures. Graduates received certificates that qualified them to work in the trade or manage their own collections. These schools treated the systematic abuse of children as an academic discipline worthy of serious study and professional development. The research and development activities conducted by leading practitioners constantly pushed the boundaries of what was possible in terms of human modification and conditioning. New surgical techniques were tested on experimental subjects. Psychological manipulation methods were refined through trial and error, and training programs were continuously updated based on the latest findings. This scientific approach to cruelty produced innovations that increased both the efficiency of the system and the suffering of its victims. The export markets that developed around concubine trading created international networks that moved boys across vast distances to serve customers in foreign lands. These operations required sophisticated logistics, diplomatic connections, and cultural knowledge to successfully navigate different legal systems and social expectations. Boys who began their lives in remote villages might end up in palaces thousands of miles away. Their journeys documented only in shipping manifests that listed them alongside other cargo. The retirement and disposal systems that handled concubines who had outlived their usefulness reflected the same callous efficiency that characterized every other aspect of the trade. Aging boys who were no longer attractive or useful were sold to secondary markets, given away as gifts to lesser customers, or simply discarded like worn-out furniture. Some ended up in brothels that catered to customers with less refined tastes, while others were put to work in menial positions where their conditioning could still be exploited for labor. And so we come to the end of our journey into this particular corner of human darkness, having witnessed how an entire civilization convinced itself that the systematic destruction of children was not just acceptable, but admirable. The boys whose stories we've told tonight weren't statistics or historical footnotes. They were real human beings who experienced unimaginable suffering, while the world around them continued as if nothing was wrong. Their legacy isn't just the individual trauma they endured, but the collective moral failure of every person who participated in, profited from, or simply accepted their abuse. From the parents who sold them to the masters who used them, from the doctors who mutilated them to the society that celebrated their degradation, everyone played a role in maintaining a system that treated children like disposable objects designed for adult pleasure. What makes this history so disturbing isn't just the cruelty itself, but how normal it seemed to those who perpetrated it. These weren't monsters hiding in shadows, but respected members of society who saw nothing wrong with what they were doing. They documented their crimes with pride, passed down their techniques to the next generation, and built institutions that ensured the practice would continue long after they were gone. The story of Chinese male concubines forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for civilizations to normalize horrific practices when they serve the interests of the powerful. It reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that moral advancement requires constant vigilance, and that the vulnerable members of society are always at risk when the rest of us look away. Tonight, we've honored the memory of these forgotten boys by refusing to let their suffering disappear into the comfortable silence that history often uses to cover its most shameful chapters. We've looked directly at what was done to them, not because we enjoyed the horror, but because forgetting would be the final insult to their memory. Their voices were silenced long ago, but their story continues to echo across the centuries, a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked and society loses its moral compass. In telling their tale, we commit ourselves to ensuring that such systematic cruelty never again finds acceptance in civilized society. The boys who suffered and died in the concubine system deserved better from the world they were born into. They deserved protection, love, and the chance to grow into the men they might have become. Instead, they were sacrificed on the altar of other people's pleasure and status, their lives considered less valuable than the temporary satisfaction they could provide. We cannot bring them back or undo the harm that was done to them, but we can remember them, honor their memory, and use their story as a reminder of our responsibility to protect the vulnerable and speak out against injustice wherever we find it. Their suffering was not meaningless if it helps us recognize and resist the forces that seek to dehumanize and exploit others. The practice of male concubinage in China finally ended not because society suddenly developed a conscience, but because changing political and economic conditions made it no longer profitable or socially useful. The boys who were trapped in the system when it collapsed found themselves abandoned by the same society that had once celebrated their exploitation, left to rebuild lives from the shattered remains of their stolen childhoods. And so we close this dark chapter of human history with a commitment to vigilance, to protection of the innocent, and to the recognition that the capacity for both great evil and great good exists within every human heart. The choice of which impulse we follow, individually and collectively, determines whether we create systems that nurture and protect our children, or ones that consume them for our own gratification. The boys whose stories we've told tonight are gone, but their memory lives on as a testament to human resilience and a warning about human cruelty. May we prove worthy of the lessons they have left us, written in suffering and sealed with silence, but still speaking across the centuries to those willing to listen and learn.